All right, let's just dive right in. We talk a lot about AI and what it could do, but what about what it absolutely must do? Especially in situations where a mistake isn't just a bad movie recommendation. We're talking disaster response, critical supply chains, places where failure is not an option. Today, we're going to break down iLuminara, an AI framework that's been built from the ground up for exactly these kinds of high-stakes environments.
So, where does this all start? Well, it starts with this number, 31.7%. According to the World Food Program, that's how much humanitarian aid gets diverted or just plain misallocated during disaster responses. Think about that. That's nearly a third of life-saving supplies just not getting where they need to go when people's lives are on the line.
And that really leads to the big question, doesn't it? We've got these incredibly powerful AI systems, so why are they falling short when the stakes are at their absolute highest? Why is there this huge gap between what the policy says should happen and what actually happens on the ground?
Yeah, this isn't just about one bad number. The research here points to a systemic crisis in how we're building and deploying AI. It's a fundamental failure of synchronization.
This slide really breaks down the why. First off, you've got something called the observer effect. Get this, the very act of checking on the system, of auditing it, actually distorts its behavior by over 23%. Then there's lighthouse decay, which is just a great name for how an ethical rule loses about 40% of its meaning as it gets passed down a long, complicated chain of command. And finally, temporal misalignment, a crippling lag, almost 15 days, between when a policy is updated and when it's actually put into practice. The cost of all this chaos? A mind-boggling $2.3 billion every single year.
So, how in the world do you fix a problem that's this deep-seated? Well, not with a quick software patch, that's for sure. iLuminara comes at this with a radically new approach. This is not just an upgrade. It's a complete rethinking of how we should build AI that we can actually trust.
And this quote really gets to the heart of it. Instead of relying on these fuzzy, open-to-interpretation ethical guidelines, iLuminara is built on measurable, enforceable principles. As the researchers Khan and Golpadasi said, the whole point is to embed these principled constraints right into the AI's core logic. You're basically designing around human bias from the very beginning.
So how does it pull this off? Well, the architecture is absolutely key. It's designed to be 80% self-contained software, with only about 20% relying on outside services. Think about it like this. The engine is in your car, right where you need it, not sitting in some server farm 1,000 miles away. This software-first design is what makes it so incredibly resilient and gives it the power to work even when it's completely offline. And this slide just lays out the difference perfectly. On the left, you've got the old way, totally dependent on the cloud, which means it's slow, you're locked into one company, and it's basically useless if you lose your internet connection. But on the right, you have the iLuminara way. It can work completely offline, you always control your own data, and you can deploy it super fast right out to the devices where the work is actually being done.
Now here's the real kicker. This incredibly efficient design, it's not a compromise. It's actually better. Recent breakthroughs in AI, which were validated in major benchmarks, show that this approach gets state-of-the-art results, but with way less data and way less computing power. It completely flips the script on the idea that bigger is always better in AI.
So, what's actually under the hood here? Let's pop it open and take a look inside this ethical engine that makes the whole thing run.
Okay, the secret sauce really comes down to these 4 core innovations you see here. They all work together to create this super robust system. Now, to give you a feel for how it works, let's just zoom in on the first 2, spatiotemporal bounding and blockchain logging.
First up is HSTPU, which is a mouthful, but the concept is simple. The best way to think about it is like a digital expiration date for data. It basically forces the AI to only use information that is recent, from the last 72 hours, and relevant, from within about 50 kilometers. This simple rule prevents so many potential errors that come from using stale, out-of-context data. Next, you have HSML, which uses blockchain. And again, the analogy is perfect. Think of it as an unforgeable cryptographic receipt for every single decision the AI makes. It creates a completely unchangeable and transparent audit trail. There's no hiding, no ambiguity, no I'm not sure what happened. Every single action is accounted for, period.
Okay, so the tech sounds really impressive, but the million-dollar question is, does it actually work in the real world? Let's take a look at the results from their field trials and simulations, because they are pretty groundbreaking.
The headline number you need to know is this: 96.3%. That is the policy compliance rate that iLuminara hit across more than 18,000 different simulations and real-world field trials. I mean, that is just a massive leap forward in reliability.
And the benefits were felt across the board. The cost of doing audits slashed by over 70%. That crazy policy lag we talked about, it was reduced by 99.9%. It went from weeks to just minutes. And this is huge. There was a measurable human benefit, a 31.6% reduction in responder anxiety. When the system is this reliable, the people who depend on it are more confident, less stressed, and way more effective.
And here's how iLuminara stacks up against the other ways of building safe AI. You can see it right here. Compared to standard methods, it's way better at following policy, it's much easier to understand why it made a decision, and it's significantly faster. The numbers, well, they really do speak for themselves.
So let's zoom out. What does all this actually mean? Because this is about more than just a better tool for logistics. This could represent a whole new direction for how we develop AI, period. This whole approach lines up perfectly with national goals for responsible innovation. And think about this. It protects free speech by creating boundaries for content instead of just censoring it. It proves that a small, really high-quality dataset can beat a massive, polluted one. And maybe the most important thing is that it pushes back against this trend of taking humans out of the loop and instead builds systems that actually preserve and even boost human agency.
And look, this isn't just an internal claim. A recent validation report from the DeepSeek AI Ethics Board said, and I quote, "iLuminara sets the new standard for operational ethical AI, and that it passed their toughest tests with 99.1% confidence." That's a huge stamp of approval.
Which really just leaves us with one final big question. We've seen that AI doesn't have to be built on these vague ethical hopes or brittle, complex rules. It can be built on clear, verifiable principles that are enforced by the code itself. So if that's true, what's the next great challenge we should point it at?